Okay, let's dive into something really important and, frankly, pretty fascinating today. We're doing a deep dive into specific learning disorders. You probably know them as things like dyslexia, maybe dysgraphia, dyscalculia. We've got a great source guiding us, a really detailed article from Self Sensei looking at the psychological profiles, sort of unpacking the cognitive side of how people with these differences learn.
That's right. And our goal here is really to sift through all this information and pull out the key insights for you. We want to clarify, what these disorders actually are, look at how they show up not just in school but day-to-day life. We'll touch on some of the brain stuff behind them, and maybe most importantly, look at the whole picture. That includes strengths, which is often overlooked, and other conditions that tend to pop up alongside them.
Yeah, hopefully we can uncover some real aha moments together.
Yeah.
So let's get straight into it. What exactly are specific learning disorders, or SLDs?
Okay, so fundamentally, they're neurodevelopmental conditions. What that really means is they affect how the brain processes certain kinds of information. This makes it, well, significantly harder to learn and use those basic academic skills, reading, writing, math. And the key thing is, this difficulty happens despite someone having, perfectly adequate intelligence and getting the usual instruction you'd expect in a classroom.
Okay, so it's definitely not about how smart someone is or if they weren't taught well enough.
Exactly. That's a common misconception.
Yeah.
They usually get picked up when kids start school and the demands ramp up. But the source makes a really good point. Sometimes they become much more obvious, or maybe get diagnosed later, like in adolescence or even adulthood when things get way more complex. College, work demands.
Right. So the underlying difference was always there. It just wasn't causing as much trouble until the pressure increased.
Precisely. The environment kind of reveals the challenge.
And how we even talk about these disorders has changed, hasn't it? I seem to remember the DSM-5 shook things up a bit.
It really did. Yeah, back in 2013, the DSM-5 took what used to be separate diagnoses like reading disorder, mathematics disorder, disorder of written expression, and brought them under one umbrella term, specific learning disorder. It reflects better understanding that these things often share features and, well, they often show up together in the same person.
So it's just one big category now. How does that work?
Well, yes, it's one main diagnosis, but with different specifiers. So you'd get a diagnosis of specific learning disorder with impairment in reading. That's basically dyslexia.
Okay.
Or with impairment in written expression, which is dysgraphia. Or with impairment in mathematics, dyscalculia.
Got it.
And the international system, the ICD-11, it does something similar, calls it developmental learning disorder,
Yeah.
but uses similar specifiers for reading, writing, and math.
Okay, so if someone, maybe a parent or a teacher, suspects an SLD, what does a clinician actually look for? How's it diagnosed?
It's quite a careful process, actually. The DSM-5 sets out 4 main criteria. First, the difficulties have to be persistent. We're talking at least 6 months, even with extra help being provided. And these difficulties have to show up as at least one of 6 specific symptoms. Things like inaccurate or slow reading, trouble understanding what's read, poor spelling, problems writing clearly, issues with number sense or calculation, or difficulties with math reasoning.
So it's not just a temporary blip. It's been going on for a while despite efforts to help.
Exactly. Persistent is key. Then the second criterion, this is crucial. The affected academic skills have to be substantially and measurably below what you'd expect for their age. And this gap has to cause significant problems in school, at work, or just in daily life activities. Standardized tests and a full clinical assessment are needed to confirm this part.
Right. It has to actually interfere with things.
Definitely. Criterion C is that the difficulties must have started during the school-age years, even if the major problems didn't really become obvious until later when demands increased. And then criterion D, this one's absolutely vital. The learning difficulties are not better explained by something else. This means ruling out things like intellectual disability, uncorrected vision or hearing issues, other mental health or neurological conditions, maybe just not having had adequate instruction or not speaking the language of instruction well, or significant psychosocial adversity.
That seems incredibly important. It really isolates it as specific, doesn't it? It's not just a side effect of something broader.
Precisely. It gets to the heart of 2 core concepts for SLDs. Specificity, meaning the impairment is focused, it's localized to certain skills or processes, and unexpectedness. The difficulties are unexpected given the person's overall cognitive ability and their learning environment.
And that unexpectedness idea, that used to be really tied to an IQ achievement gap, didn't it? Like high IQ score but low reading score meant dyslexia. But the source mentioned that model had problems, like the wait to fail issue.
Yes, exactly. The wait-to-fail critique was a big deal. Waiting for that discrepancy to become large meant kids often missed out on early intervention. So current guidelines, like in the DSM-5 and the IDA legislation in the U.S., they no longer require that strict IQ achievement gap calculation. Now, unexpectedness is considered part of that broader clinical picture, looking at the persistent difficulties despite good instruction, and those skills being substantially below age level. It's a much more holistic view.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. Let's jump into the first specific profile, dyslexia, impairment in reading. It sounds like there's a pretty clear core cognitive issue identified here.
There is. The most robust finding, really, across decades of research on dyslexia points to a core deficit in phonological processing.
Phonological processing, that's about the sounds of
And what
language, actually.
it's the ability to perceive, understand, and manipulate the sound structure of spoken language.
Like knowing bat has 3 sounds, B-A-T, and that it rhymes with cat.
Precisely. It shows up in a few key ways. One is phonological awareness, difficulty recognizing and working with the sounds within words. Rhyming, breaking words into syllables, identifying individual sounds, those can all be tricky. And what's really interesting, as the source points out, is that you can often spot these difficulties before a child even starts formal reading instruction.
Wow, so the signs can be there really early.
They can. Another aspect is phonological memory. This is like your working memory specifically for sounds. If that's weak, it's hard to hold sound information in your mind, which you need for, say, sounding out longer words or remembering sequences of sounds.
Okay.
And then there's phonological processing speed, often measured with rapid automatized naming or RAN tasks. That's basically how quickly you can name familiar things like letters, numbers, colors, or objects presented visually. It taps into how fast you can retrieve the sounds associated with symbols.
So this trouble with sounds makes that absolutely fundamental link between the letters you see on the page and the sounds they represent really unstable or wobbly.
That's a great way to put it. It makes decoding, sounding out words, extremely challenging and inefficient. And while that phonological piece is primary, the source notes other cognitive areas are often affected too. Things like general working memory, holding the text, its meaning, sentence structure all in mind at once, and overall processing speed can also be weaker. Orthographic skills, which is about recognizing the visual forms of words, that also plays a part.
So how does all of that actually look when someone is trying to read or learn in school?
Well, you typically see inaccurate or very slow word reading. Lots of guessing based on context, difficulty sounding out unfamiliar words. Reading rate and fluency are usually significantly impacted. Reading is slow, labored, takes a ton of effort.
And I imagine that just sucks up all their mental energy, right? Leaving very little room for actually understanding what they're reading.
It often does, yeah. That intense effort needed just for decoding consumes cognitive resources. There's less bandwidth left over for comprehension. This is what the source calls the fluency comprehension cascade. But here's a really interesting point. Listening comprehension is frequently a relative strength.
Oh, because it bypasses the decoding.
Exactly. They can often understand complex spoken language perfectly well, which really highlights that the difficulty is specific to the written word, not language ability overall.
That must feel like such a disconnect for them. And I hear spelling is usually a major challenge too.
Yes, spelling difficulties are a hallmark of dyslexia and often persist even when reading improves. Spelling requires you to go from sounds back to letters, which really taps into those phonological weaknesses and difficulties storing the visual forms of words.
Right.
Written expression more broadly can also be affected. And understandably, because reading and writing are so effortful and frustrating, many individuals with dyslexia tend to avoid those tasks when they can, preferring maybe audio or video formats.
Let's dig a bit more into information processing. Beyond the phonology, what else is going on?
Well, there's that core difficulty with decoding, linking letters to sounds. And then there's orthographic mapping. This is the process our brains use to store the visual appearance of words so we can recognize them instantly on sight without having to sound them out every single time.
Like building a mental dictionary of word images.
Exactly. People with dyslexia often struggle with this mapping process. It takes many more exposures to a word for it to become instantly recognizable. They don't build that visual word library as automatically.
Okay, that makes sense why reading practice is so key.
It is. And another processing area the source mentions is sequential processing. This seems to be about difficulty handling information that needs to be kept in a specific order. This obviously impacts reading letter order in words, word order in sentences and spelling, the sequence of letters. But interestingly, it can also show up in non-language tasks, like following multi-step instructions, remembering sequences like the alphabet, days of the week, months of the year.
Huh, that's fascinating. Could that point to maybe a more fundamental challenge with ordered information beyond just language?
Some researchers definitely think so. It's an interesting angle. But while we're talking about the challenges, it's absolutely crucial, as the source emphasizes, to remember the other side of the coin. The cognitive landscape of dyslexia is often described as a spiky profile,
Right.
or as Shewitz called it, a sea of strengths alongside the weaknesses.
I love that framing. What kinds of strengths are we talking about?
Often really strong reasoning and problem-solving abilities. They can be excellent conceptual thinkers, good at seeing the big picture. Visuospatial skills are frequently highlighted as a strength. Think excelling at puzzles, design, engineering, architecture, visual arts, even sports requiring spatial awareness. Some research even hints at potential advantages in certain visual tasks, maybe as a kind of compensation, or just a different way the brain is wired.
That's such an empowering perspective that the same brain differences might actually confer advantages in some areas.
It's definitely a perspective gaining traction. Other strengths often include creativity, thinking outside the box, strong conceptual abilities, and, as we mentioned, often very strong oral language skills,
Mm.
good vocabulary, great listening comprehension, engaging conversationalists.
Okay.
Empathy and interpersonal skills are also sometimes noted as strengths.
So you could genuinely have someone who struggles intensely to sound out a simple word, but who can grasp a complex, abstract concept instantly, or, I don't know, design something brilliant.
Exactly that kind of profile. The weaknesses tend to cluster around those phonological skills, working memory, processing speed or rapid naming, sequential memory. Learning foreign languages is often very difficult. And sometimes organization and time management can be challenging, which often links into executive functions.
Ah, executive functions, those higher level skills like planning, organizing, self-monitoring. How do they fit into the dyslexia picture?
They're very closely linked.
Yeah.
Weaknesses in executive functions, things like working memory, which we already know is often impacted, but also planning, organization, starting tasks, sustaining attention, being flexible in your thinking, monitoring your own understanding. These often co-occur with dyslexia or are kind of exacerbated by it. If the basic act of reading is incredibly demanding, it just consumes the available executive function resources you'd normally use for managing the task, planning your writing, or keeping track of time.
So it's like a double whammy, a compounding effect.
It can definitely feel that way. The sheer cognitive load of effortful reading heavily taxes those EFs. And while EF deficits are the primary issue in something like ADHD, with dyslexia, they might be particularly strained by literacy tasks, even if general EFs seem okay otherwise. Supporting EFs becomes really important.
Really interesting. Okay, let's pivot from reading to writing. Dysgraphia, the impairment in written expression. What's the cognitive story here?
Okay, so dysgraphia involves significant ongoing struggles with writing skills. This can range from the actual physical act of forming letters all the way up to organizing complex thoughts on paper. And again, crucially, it's unexpected given the person's age, overall intelligence, and the education they've received.
And like dyslexia, it's probably not just one single thing causing the writing problems.
No, definitely not. Dysgraphia is quite heterogeneous. The source outlines a few different potential underlying issues. One involves fine motor skill deficits. This is sometimes called motor dysgraphia. Here, the main issue is the physical act of writing an awkward pencil grip. Really messy or inconsistent handwriting, writing incredibly slowly, maybe even hand pain or fatigue.
The physical effort alone sounds exhausting.
It really can be. Another potential source is difficulty with orthographic coding or processing. This isn't about the muscles. It's about the brain's ability to store and retrieve the visual images of letters and words, and the motor plans needed to write them down fluently. It's vital for spelling accurately and writing at a reasonable speed. If you can't easily recall what the word because looks like, writing it is going to be slow and error-prone.
Okay. And then there's the language aspect of writing itself.
Yes, deficits in language processing specifically for output, sometimes called linguistic dysgraphia. Here, the main struggle is translating thoughts and spoken language into grammatical, organized, written language. The handwriting might actually be okay, quite legible sometimes, but the content is poor. You see lots of grammar errors, awkward sentence structure, trouble finding the right words when writing, poor organization, lack of clarity.
Ah, so this is the profile where someone might speak really eloquently, but their writing just doesn't reflect that at all.
Exactly. That discrepancy between strong verbal expression and poor written output is often a key signpost for this type of dysgraphia. There can also be issues with visual spatial processing, spatial dysgraphia, affecting things like consistent letter size, spacing between words, writing on the line, organizing text spatially on the page.
Right.
And the source also notes the overlap with dyslexia, sometimes termed dyslexic dysgraphia, where the primary writing difficulty stems from poor spelling due to phonological and orthographic issues, even if the motor aspects of writing are relatively fine.
So what does this look like academically? What's the footprint in school or work?
Well, impaired spelling accuracy is extremely common, linked to those phonological and orthographic memory issues we discussed. Frequent errors in grammar and punctuation, omitted words, poor word order. A really significant challenge often lies in clarity and organization. Even if they have fantastic ideas, getting them down in a clear, coherent, well-structured way is incredibly difficult. Handwriting quality, for those with a motor component, is often poor, illegible, messy, inconsistent size and form, very slow.
And that slow writing speed must make timed tests, essays, or even just taking notes a real struggle.
Absolutely. Time tasks can be a nightmare. And just like with dyslexia, this often leads to avoidance of writing tasks whenever possible because they're just so draining and frustrating.
You mentioned that gap between speaking well and writing poorly as a key indicator. It really highlights that the problem is with the modality of expression, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows it's not a lack of ideas or intelligence, it's the translation into written form that's the barrier. The source uses a brilliant analogy here. It describes the lower-level mechanics of writing, like handwriting, spelling, basic grammar, as being like navigating windy back roads.
Oh, okay.
They consume so much cognitive energy and attention that there are very few resources left for the higher-level thinking needed for writing things like organizing complex arguments, elaborating on ideas, using varied vocabulary, ensuring clarity. That's the wide-open highway they can't easily access. So their written work often ends up looking much simpler or less developed than their actual thinking.
That's a powerful image, the windy back roads versus the highway. What about the broader information processing involved in dysgraphia?
Fundamentally, it's about that breakdown in translating thoughts to text. But it also involves difficulties specifically with idea generation, planning, and organization for writing. Working memory is under huge strain. You have to hold your ideas, retrieve vocabulary, remember grammar rules, manage sentence structure, and monitor what you're producing all at the same time.
Wow.
Phonological processing is still relevant for spelling. Auditory or visual processing might be involved, depending on the subtype. And there's that sequential processing, again, ordering letters correctly in words and sentences, ideas in paragraphs or essays.
So writing is just this incredibly complex cognitive juggling act, and if any one part is weak, the whole system struggles.
That's a perfect way to put it. Coordinating motor output, orthographic memory, language formulation, organization, attention, and self-monitoring all at once is hugely demanding. A weakness anywhere can disrupt the whole process. But again, even with these significant writing challenges, individuals with dysgraphia often possess notable strengths in other areas.
What might those look like?
Very commonly, strong, sometimes even superior, verbal expression and oral skills. They might be fantastic conversationalists, storytellers, debaters, presenters. Oral memory and recall might be strong. Interpersonal skills, leadership qualities are sometimes noted. Problem solving, maybe that big picture thinking can be a strength, perhaps developed as they find other ways to communicate their ideas. And of course, general intelligence is typically average or above average.
So the classic example might be someone who's incredibly persuasive in a meeting, but absolutely dreads having to write the follow-up email.
That profile fits very well. The weaknesses tend to cluster around fine motor skills for writing, orthographic coding, visual spatial skills related to text production, phonological skills relevant to spelling, working memory specifically taxed during writing, and those writing-related executive functions.
And EFs again, central to writing.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Planning and organization are fundamental for structuring any piece of writing beyond simple sentences. It's actually part of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for the written expression specifier. Task initiation, just getting started on writing, can be a huge hurdle. Working memory, as we said, is vital. Self-monitoring and evaluation for editing and revising. Sustained attention for longer writing tasks. Cognitive flexibility to shift gears and revise effectively. And emotional regulation to manage the inevitable frustration.
EFs really sound like the conductor leading the writing orchestra.
That's a great analogy. And weak EFs definitely contribute to disorganized, inefficient writing. And similar to what we discussed with dyslexia, it's often bidirectional. Weak EFs make writing harder, And the intense struggle and effort involved in writing can deplete already limited EF resources. It can create a really negative cycle of difficulty, frustration, and avoidance.
That makes complete sense. Okay, let's move to our third profile. Dyscalculia, the impairment in mathematics. What's the core difficulty here?
Right, dyscalculia involves significant and persistent problems learning or performing mathematical skills. Again, it's not explained by intellectual disability, lack of schooling, sensory issues, or other disorders, and it occurs despite average or sometimes above average abilities in other areas, like language.
What are the key cognitive challenges underlying dyscalculia?
A really foundational one seems to be a deficit in what's called number sense. This is that basic intuitive grasp of numbers, what they represent in terms of quantity, how they relate to each other, how operations like addition or subtraction change them. It's considered a core issue. And here's something really interesting the source highlights. People with dyscalculia often have trouble with subitizing.
Subitizing, what's that?
It's the ability to instantly recognize the number of items in a small set without needing to count them one by one. Like you see 3 dots on a dice, and you just know it's 3, you don't count 1, 2, 3.
Oh, right. Okay.
People with dyscalculia often lack that instant recognition for small quantities. It's almost like the math equivalent of the phonological deficit in dyslexia, a problem with a very basic building block of the domain, in this case, quantity intuition. Closely related is difficulty with magnitude representation, understanding, and mentally comparing the size of numbers. Is 8 bigger than 7? That seems obvious, but the mental representation might be fuzzy.
Okay. What other cognitive pieces are involved?
Mathematical working memory is a big one. Specifically, difficulties holding and manipulating numerical and sometimes visuospatial information in mind. Math problems often require you to hold numbers, intermediate steps, and rules simultaneously. A weak math working memory makes that incredibly hard.
I can see that.
And then there's difficulty with long-term memory for math facts, retrieving basic arithmetic facts automatically, like 7 times 8 is 56. Individuals with dyscalculia often struggle to memorize these facts and continue to rely on slower, more effortful strategies like finger counting long after their peers have automated them.
So it's kind of a double hit, struggling with the basic facts and struggling with the deeper understanding or number sense.
Yes, it's often described exactly like that. A dual challenge impacting both rote fact retrieval and conceptual understanding. The weak number sense undermines conceptual learning, and poor working memory and fact retrieval make procedures really difficult. Visual spatial skills can also play a role for some, affecting things like aligning numbers in columns for calculations, understanding geometry, interpreting graphs, or even visualizing a mental number line.
How does this typically manifest in math class or even just everyday life?
Well, you see that persistent struggle with memorizing and retrieving basic math facts. Continued use of immature strategies like finger counting. Calculations are often inaccurate, very slow, effortful. They might get lost in the steps of a multi-step problem. Mathematical reasoning can be quite difficult, especially tackling word problems. That's often a double hurdle because it requires language comprehension plus figuring out the math steps.
Right, translating words into operations.
Exactly. Identifying the relevant information, choosing the right operation, interpreting the result. They might also struggle with understanding specific math language and symbols. And as you mentioned, the impact on everyday math is significant trouble telling time on an analog clock, managing money, budgeting, reading schedules, measurement, estimation, things many of us take for granted.
It really affects practical life skills. What about the information processing involved specifically in math?
It involves difficulties. Processing numerical information generally, it tends to be slower and more error-prone. Difficulty grasping numerical symbolism, the abstract nature of numbers and symbols. If the symbol 5 doesn't automatically connect strongly to the concept of 5 things, learning math operations is built on shaky ground. Concrete examples become really important.
Makes sense.
Quantitative reasoning, understanding numerical relationships, concepts like place value is often weak. Visuospatial processing in the context of math can be an issue, as we mentioned, lining things up, graphs, geometry, the mental number line, even just organizing work on the page. And there it is again. Sequential processing, following the steps in the correct order for calculations or procedures, remembering counting sequences.
Wow, sequential processing really does seem to be a recurring theme across all 3 SLDs we've discussed.
It does seem to pop up consistently as relevant to handling ordered information, whether it's sounds, letters, words, ideas, or numbers and steps. Now, even with these math-specific challenges, let's talk about the strengths often seen in people with dyscalculia.
Okay, what might someone with dyscalculia excel at?
Well, often they have average or above average general intelligence overall. Strengths in verbal and linguistic skills are quite common. They might be great readers, writers, strong in subjects like history or social studies. Creativity and artistic talents are frequently noted. Strengths in problem solving or strategic thinking, they might find clever non-numerical ways to approach problems. Maybe they're good big picture thinkers. Intuitive thinking or social perception can also be strengths.
So maybe really strong with words, concepts, maybe very creative or socially adept, but numbers themselves are just inherently confusing or difficult.
That's a very common profile, yes. The weaknesses really cluster around that core number sense. Mathematical working memory, math fact retrieval, visuospatial skills as applied to math, and understanding concepts like time and measurement.
And executive functions, I assume they're critical for math too.
Absolutely vital. Working memory, as we've said, is crucial for holding information during calculations. Inhibition is needed. Think about ignoring irrelevant numbers or information in a word problem. Cognitive flexibility is important for switching between different strategies or steps. Planning and organization are key for structuring how you solve a complex problem. Task initiation, getting started on math homework, can be tough. Self-monitoring, checking your work, asking if an answer makes sense.
And managing that feeling of panic when faced with a math problem.
Definitely. And this is something the source really stresses: math anxiety.
Yep.
It is incredibly common in individuals with dyscalculia, and it creates this truly detrimental, vicious cycle. Anxiety itself consumes working memory resources, the very resources you need for math. It interferes with focus, it hinders problem solving. Basically, it diverts brain power away from the task.
Wow.
So for someone already struggling with the underlying math concepts, this added layer of anxiety can cripple their ability to perform, leading to more errors, which then reinforces the anxiety. It spirals. Addressing the math anxiety is often just as critical, maybe even more so initially, than teaching the math skills themselves.
That's such an important point. The anxiety isn't just an emotional reaction, it actively interferes with the cognitive process.
Precisely. It becomes part of the problem itself.
Okay, we've really explored the individual profiles in depth, but the source makes it clear that SLDs are very varied and they rarely exist in a vacuum. Let's zoom out to that bigger picture. First, this idea of heterogeneity.
Yes, it's so important. SLDs are definitely not one size fits all. There's huge variability. Severity ranges from mild to moderate to severe, as defined in the DSM-5. Each person has their own unique constellation of cognitive strengths and weaknesses. And people develop and use different compensatory strategies throughout their lives, which also influences how the SLD presents.
And you mentioned earlier, sometimes those strengths or really good strategies can actually hide the underlying difficulty, make it harder to spot.
Absolutely, especially in people who are bright overall. Effective compensation can mask the sheer effort they're expending to keep up or perform at an average level. This can lead to delayed diagnosis, sometimes significantly delayed, which is why that comprehensive assessment looking at the underlying cognitive processes is so important, not just relying on surface-level academic scores.
And these are lifelong conditions, right? But they don't necessarily look the same at age 6 versus age 16 or 36.
Exactly. The manifestation changes across the lifespan. Early signs in preschool might be subtle trouble with rhymes, counting, maybe fine motor skills. In elementary school, it's the classic struggles with learning to read fluently, master multiplication facts, or write legibly. Then in adolescence and adulthood, the foundational deficits often evolve into challenges with things like reading volume and speed, organizing complex essays or reports, managing time and long-term projects, or applying math concepts in higher education or the workplace. The demands increase and the challenges adapt.
So the underlying difference persists, but how it shows up depends on the environment and the demands.
Precisely. And adults, through experience, often develop very sophisticated coping mechanisms and strategies.
That progression must really impact navigating things like college or choosing a career path.
It certainly does. Higher education presents a significant jump in band, demands more reading, more complex writing, potentially higher-level math, and generally less structured support, more independence required. Without appropriate accommodations and self-awareness, there's definitely a risk of underachievement or even dropping out. Success often hinges on accessing supports like extended time, assistive technology, getting notes, but also, critically for adults, developing strong self-advocacy skills.
Being able to explain what you need and why.
Exactly. Understanding your own profile and being able to articulate your needs to professors or employers is absolutely key. Course choices and career paths might be influenced consciously or unconsciously.
But success is definitely achievable, right? Especially if people can lean into those strengths we discussed.
Absolutely. The source is clear on this. Many adults with SLDs find significant success by leveraging their strengths, using assistive technology effectively, seeking appropriate workplace accommodations, and finding environments that are a good fit. Choosing careers that align with strengths rather than directly challenging weaknesses is often a smart strategy. The outcomes are highly variable and certainly not predetermined.
Now, you mentioned earlier that these conditions rarely travel alone, as you put it. Comorbidities, other co-occurring conditions, seem to be really common. What are the big ones?
Yes, comorbidity is more the rule than the exception with SLDs. The most common co-occurring condition by far is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's a very high rate of overlap across all three SLDs: dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia.
And that combination must be particularly challenging.
It often is, yes. Because the symptoms, especially those related to executive functions like attention regulation, working memory, organization, planning, impulsivity, they can be additive or even interact in ways that make things worse than either condition alone. It often leads to more severe academic difficulties and challenges in daily functioning.
So dyslexia plus ADHD presents a more complex clinical picture than just dyslexia.
Generally speaking, yes. It adds another layer of complexity, often making those EF challenges more prominent and pervasive. Beyond ADHD, anxiety disorders are also extremely common emotional comorbidities. Things like generalized anxiety, social anxiety, or very specific academic anxieties, test anxiety, reading anxiety, that math anxiety we talked about with dyscalculia. The source points out that a large percentage of young people with SLDs report significantly higher levels of anxiety than their peers.
That makes horrible sense. Facing constant struggle and potential failure in school every day would be incredibly stressful.
It absolutely is. And relatedly, mood disorders, particularly depression, can also develop. This might be a consequence of the persistent academic struggles, feeling different from peers, chronic low self-esteem, or social difficulties that can sometimes arise. Hopelessness can set in.
How do these co-occurring conditions typically impact the overall picture of the SLD?
They significantly complicate things, both assessment and intervention. They can amplify the cognitive challenges, especially impacting executive functions. Think about it. Anxiety and depression themselves consume cognitive resources, particularly working memory. They make it harder to concentrate. They can lead to avoidance behaviors. They decrease motivation. It often creates these really difficult to break vicious cycles, which means that effective support really needs to be integrated. You have to address all the coexisting conditions, the anxiety, the mood issues, the ADHD, alongside the specific learning disorder itself. You can't just focus on the reading or math in isolation.
This just hammers home why that comprehensive assessment you described earlier is so critical. How does that process actually untangle these different threads, the SLD, the ADHD, the anxiety, and figure out what's driving what?
It's definitely complex, and it really requires a multidisciplinary approach. Clinical psychologists, educational psychologists, neuropsychologists, specialist teachers, maybe speech therapists or OTs. The goals are multifaceted. Confirm if an SLD is present, figure out which domain, reading, writing, math, pinpoint the specific underlying cognitive processes that are weak, differentiate the SLD from other conditions that might cause similar symptoms, identify any co-occurring conditions like ADHD or anxiety, and ultimately provide clear, actionable recommendations for intervention and support.
So what does that assessment battery typically look like?
It usually involves several components: a thorough clinical interview covering developmental, medical, educational, and family history, behavioral observations in different settings if possible, standardized rating scales completed by parents, teachers, and sometimes the individual themselves, looking at attention, executive functions, mood, anxiety, behavior, assessment of overall intellectual or cognitive abilities using tests like IQ tests, but again, not just to look for a discrepancy score. It's more about understanding the person's overall cognitive potential, identifying areas of strength, and looking closely at specific cognitive processing areas like working memory, processing speed, verbal versus nonverbal skills.
Okay.
Then, crucially, comprehensive academic achievement testing, using standardized tests to get objective measures of reading, writing, and math skills compared to age peers.
And then that deeper dive into the specific cognitive nuts and bolts.
Exactly. Specific cognitive process assessment. This often involves more specialized neuropsychological tests designed to measure those underlying functions we've been talking about. So, tests of phonological awareness, phonological memory, and rapid naming for suspected dyslexia. Tests assessing fine motor speed and dexterity, orthographic coding, or language formulation for suspected dysgraphia. Tests looking at number sense, magnitude comparison, math-related working memory, or calculation fluency for suspected dyscalculia.
Right.
Sometimes, particularly in schools, evaluating the student's response to intervention, RTI, how they progress with targeted evidence-based teaching is also part of the diagnostic picture.
And it's this detailed, multi-layered process that helps figure out, for instance, if someone's poor writing is mainly due to the spelling problems from underlying dyslexia, or if it's more of a primary dysgraphia with motor coordination or language output issues, or maybe even EF problems impacting organization.
Precisely. It allows for that careful differentiation. It helps create a detailed cognitive profile that shows where the breakdowns are occurring, identifies any overlaps between conditions, helps rule out alternative explanations, and leads to a much more nuanced diagnosis that can actually guide effective, tailored interventions.
So if we step back again from the individual profiles, based on everything we've discussed, are there certain cognitive factors that seem to cut across multiple or maybe even all of these SLDs, kind of common threads?
Yes, I think there are a few that stand out. Executive functions are definitely a major one. As we've seen, EFs like working memory, planning, organization, attention control, and cognitive flexibility are critical for all complex academic learning. Weaknesses in these areas can contribute to the learning difficulties seen in SLDs, or, as we discussed, the struggle of dealing with an SLD can heavily tax and exacerbate underlying EF weaknesses. That bidirectional relationship seems really key across the board.
Okay, EFs are definitely central. What about visuospatial processing? We heard it could be a strength in dyslexia, but more often a weakness related to dysgraphia or dyscalculia.
Right, so its role is more variable, it seems. It can be a relative or even significant strength for some individuals with dyslexia, perhaps contributing to strengths in fields like art, design, or engineering. However, visual spatial skills can be a specific area of weakness within the context of dysgraphia, impacting handwriting mechanics, letter formation, spacing, and organizing text on a page. And they can also be a weakness within the context of dyscalculia, affecting things like aligning numbers, interpreting graphs, understanding geometry, or using that mental number line. So its role isn't universally the same across all individuals with SLDs, but where it is relevant, either as a strength or a weakness, its impact within that specific domain, reading, writing, or math, is significant.
Okay, that makes sense. And sequential information processing, that one seemed to come up in relation to all three.
Yes, that one does seem to be a potential cross-cutting factor, maybe reflecting a common underlying vulnerability for some individuals. Difficulty processing information that is presented or needs to be recalled in a specific sequence appears relevant for decoding and spelling in dyslexia, the order of sounds and letters. It seems important for dysgraphia in terms of ordering letters within words, words within sentences, and ideas within a larger text. And it's relevant for dyscalculia when following the steps in math procedures or learning counting sequences or multiplication tables. So while the specific way it manifests differs depending on the academic domain, a challenge with processing ordered information does seem to be a recurring theme worth considering.
This level of complexity, the overlaps, the comorbidities, it really underscores why looking at the whole person, the entire profile, is just so essential.
Absolutely. Which brings us really nicely to a critical point the source emphasizes: the importance of shifting the focus beyond just identifying deficits towards leveraging individual strengths and developing effective compensatory strategies.
Right, moving towards empowerment rather than just remediation. How does that work in practice?
It really starts with identifying those unique strengths we talked about for each profile. Is its strong verbal reasoning, great visuospatial skills, creativity, big picture thinking, problem-solving ability. Once those are identified, the goal is to actively use those strengths to support learning and performance in areas of difficulty. So if someone with dyslexia has strong visual skills, maybe using mind maps or graphic organizers helps them structure ideas for writing. If someone with dysgraphia is a great talker, encourage them to dictate their first drafts using speech to text or give oral presentations instead of written reports sometimes. If someone with dyscalculia has good verbal reasoning, talking through the steps of a math problem out loud might help. You build on that sea of strengths.
I like that. Actively harnessing the things they are good at. And then complementing that with strategies or accommodations to kind of bypass or work around the areas of weakness.
Exactly. Those strategies and accommodations are essential tools, and they often evolve across the lifespan as demands change. For dyslexia, we're talking about things like assistive technology, text-to-speech software to listen to text, audiobooks, spell checkers, grammar checkers, accommodations like extended time on tests, access to lecture notes, and of course, specialized, structured, multi-sensory instruction like Orton Gillingham, especially earlier on. For adults, it might be more about strategic use of digital tools, breaking down large reading tasks, ensuring a quiet workspace.
Okay. And for dysgraphia?
Using word processors is often huge, bypassing handwriting difficulties. Speech-to-text software can be transformative, using graphic organizers to plan writing, getting extended time, maybe a reduced writing load on some assignments, or alternative formats like oral exams or projects. Sometimes having a scribe can help, or grading policies that focus more on content and ideas rather than purely on mechanics for certain assignments. Explicit instruction of the writing process itself is also key, and for some, occupational therapy can help with the motor aspects.
Right. And for dyscalculia, what helps there?
Using calculators routinely for computation frees up cognitive resources for reasoning. Having access to math fact charts or multiplication tables. Using graph paper can help with aligning numbers and organizing work. Extra time is often necessary. Breaking down complex problems into smaller, manageable steps. Using multisensory approaches like manipulatives, blocks, counters to make concepts concrete. Relating math to real-life examples. Specialized math programs designed for dyscalculia can be very beneficial. And as we discussed, critically important is providing emotional support and strategies specifically aimed at reducing that math anxiety.
It sounds like there are lots of practical tools available. The source really emphasizes fostering self-understanding and self-advocacy as part of this whole process, too.
It's absolutely paramount, especially for long-term success and well-being. Helping individuals understand their own unique learning profile, what comes easily, what's genuinely challenging, and why is incredibly empowering. That self-understanding forms the foundation for self-advocacy, being able to effectively communicate needs, request appropriate accommodations, and explain their strengths in educational settings, in the workplace, and just in life. It's about taking ownership and navigating the world effectively with their specific cognitive makeup.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it seems clear that specific learning disorders, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, are these complex neurodevelopmental differences. They're definitely not related to overall intelligence. They each have distinct core cognitive profiles, but there are also significant overlaps, especially around things like executive functions and maybe sequential processing. And it's really the norm, not the exception, for them to co-occur with other conditions like ADHD, anxiety, or mood disorders, which adds another layer of complexity to the picture.
Absolutely. And the key takeaway seems to be that moving forward requires really comprehensive assessment to understand that full, unique pattern of challenges and strengths for each person. While the difficulties associated with SLDs are real and often persist, the focus should be on leveraging those individual strengths and consistently using effective strategies and accommodations. That's what truly allows individuals to navigate academic and occupational demands successfully and reach their potential. It's really about shifting perspective, isn't it? From seeing only a deficit to understanding and valuing a different kind of cognitive profile.
That is a powerful reframing, which leads us perfectly into our final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe mull over. Given these notable strengths that are often observed in individuals with SLDs, particularly in areas like creativity, problem solving, visuospatial skills, and big picture thinking, how might our education systems and maybe even our workplaces need to adapt or evolve? How can they move beyond just focusing on remediation to truly value, nurture, and even capitalize on these unique cognitive profiles?